We begin with breaking news from Charlottesville, Virginia, where 2 people have been injured in an altercation with protesters who are out in force over the planned removal of a Confederate statue. Watch this.
Hi, and welcome to Take a Walk on the Right Side, a podcast dedicated to understanding the key ideas, books, organizations, and individuals that comprise an increasingly transnational far-right-wing movement. Take a Walk on the Right Side hosts open and nuanced discussion between myself, Jesse Morton, once a jihadist propagandist, and Matt Heimbach, himself once a white nationalist and far-right-wing ideologue. Matt was considered by many to be the future face of white supremacy in the United States, particularly after the disastrous 2017 Unite the Right rally he co-organized in Charlottesville. Since then, however, Matt has departed the movement and has transitioned toward new understandings and beginnings. We seek to assist by providing a deeper, first-hand look at the threat the extreme right poses. We do so each week by analyzing the impact of key propaganda pieces, the impact they've had on creating a constantly mutating ideology and worldview that drives far-right-wing movements currently. By including our personal experiences in between, we aim to document similarities across the myriad ideological strands of extremism. At the same time, we hope to encourage others not to be deluded by the extremist mindset of recruiters and to leave if they are actively involved. Without further ado. So welcome back to another edition of Take a Walk on the Right Side. Last week, we started our series discussing the key books and ideologues that have driven far-right ideologies and their metastasizations onto the current era. We discussed the Turner Diaries, a 1978 novel published under the pseudonym Andrew MacDonald by William Luther Pierce, a founder of the Neo-Nazi National Alliance, someone who was directly affiliated with George Lincoln Rockwell, the founder of Nazism in the United States, we might say. And we talked about the impact of the Turner Diaries on the current strand of far-right-wing extremism and terrorism in particular. It happened to occur that we recorded that episode on the 25th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombings, the bombings that were carried out by Timothy McVeigh, in which he carried pages of the Turner Diaries in order to make an exclamation point on the fact that he was doing so in the name of a cause. Matt took us last week on a journey that covered the strand of far-right-wing thinking that he called the patriot or militia movement component. And in order to get to an important realization that it wasn't just the ideology that drove Timothy McVeigh, but also events that were occurring between the period of 1978 and 1985, particularly those that occurred in Waco. And also with regard to Ruby Ridge, we talked about the National Alliance, and we talked about a number of individuals and organizations that were offshoots of that patriot and militia sort of support for the type of narrative and grievance that the Turner Diaries was espousing. This week, having listened to Matt describe it as absolutely necessary that we distinguish between 2 strands of far-right-wing extremist interpretation, that being apart from the militia and patriot movement, one that he categorized at the end of last week's discourse as Mansonite, meaning Charles Manson, Masonite, meaning James Mason, who knew William Luther Pierce, was influenced by him, and who went on to promote the book Siege, and even what Matt referred to as Jihadi Neo-Nazism, what is now being referred to somewhat haphazardly and almost in a blanketed way as accelerationism. And so today Matt's going to take us off on a different trajectory and talk about the more extreme far-right's interpretations of the Turner Diaries, or the principles espoused in the Turner Diaries, how they evolved into what we see currently, and some of the connections between the most current interpretations of the extreme far right and their calls to leaderless resistance or lone wolf terrorism, and how in some ways they are attached from the ideas that are promoted in the Turner Diaries. Matt, I hope that that summary and recap did us justice to get started for this week. Do you think that we can continue from there, revisiting where we left off?
Yeah, so we're going to go into basically kind of the 3 stools of, or the 3 legs of the stool of accelerationism, and kind of how those intersects, right? On one of them, I would say that was William Pierce, of course, with the National Alliance being a political organization, but through his books pushing a slightly different agenda. Then we've got the James Mason, but also a figure that I feel is really not discussed enough in the understanding of post-war fascist movements, especially this accelerationist brand, is Joseph Tomasi, who really can be seen, I think, as the inspiration for James Mason. So that's really the foundation. And then, of course, we've got Charles Manson, right? So we've got these three legs of the stool, which on the top is political terror. The only thing they understand, which is was one of the mottos of the National Socialist Liberation Front, which was Joseph Tomasi's organization. And yeah, so going back to the Turner Diaries, right? We discussed rather in depth, especially how the militia movement, how organizations like the Order came out of the militia movement, and then we've got this idea of how are the individuals involved going to accomplish their goals, right? Because the Turner Diaries is fundamentally based on there being a hierarchical organization, a traditional sort of political party to a certain extent, and an underground that has is working in many ways kind of an example of the Bolsheviks during the Tsarist times, where the organization has members that are working within the government to help undermine it. You've got political activists, and then of course you've got those that are engaged in guerrilla warfare, essentially. That really reflects a lot of kind of anti-imperialist movements, but with like a huge slant, say like the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, and its political wing Sinn Féin. But we see this shift happen, both in the movement, and Pierce encapsulates kind of all of this in his 1989 book Hunter, right? So Hunter is technically sort of a prequel to the Turner Diaries, but I really think it sums up in a way the ideological shift that happens between the publishing of the Turner Diaries and then going forward to 1989. We're looking at the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the shifts that we're seeing in the American economy, with the beginning of free trade agreements, outsourcing, the decaying middle class. Of course, really the psychological impact of the loss of the war in Vietnam on Middle America, things like that, really encapsulate into this concept of leaderless resistance and of direct action, right? So just to, I always like to start with a little bit of a quote, right? So coming from the third page of Hunter, it laying out the character in Hunter is Oscar Jaeger. Jaeger, of course, is German for Hunter, and which is the name of the book, obviously. And it's discussing how he's gone out and done a bunch of shootings of interracial couples, targeting people that he viewed as an enemy. Oscar Jaeger is portrayed, he's a veteran, which I think is important. That kind of ties back into the militia thing that we talked about before, where an increasing amount of people like Timothy McVeigh didn't view themselves like that they had served the country, that the country didn't represent them anymore, and they just strike back. And I think this is interesting because it gets in the psychology of all the things we're talking about. So after he's done some of these killings, the book reads, when the second double killing came 4 days later, it had been mentioned briefly in the inside pages of the Post and then quietly dropped. The third, fourth, and fifth pairs of shootings had been greeted with total media silence. The reason was clear. At some time between the second and third shootings, it had dawned on the media that the killings were racially motivated, and the realization frightened them. They didn't want to encourage any would-be imitators, or even give hope to a great many Americans who would cheer anyone who might be going around picking off racially mixed couples. And then it goes on from there. But yeah, so I really think going back into a discussion we had really in the earlier episodes as well, between the political and the accelerationist wings of white nationalism in general, and the accelerationists have really kind of come to a point, even in the 1970s and the 1980s, of there being those that want to engage the system politically and legally, and those that want to just totally throw it out, right? And this falls back to Charles Manson, with of course the concept of helter-skelter. For those who are unaware of what Charles Manson wanted, his vision really was that they were going to provoke a racial conflict. He actually was saying things such as that as there was kind of a whiplash to civil rights, that there would be a conflict between whites who were liberal, whites who were old school segregationists and things like that, and then the black population, where his vision was to hide essentially with his harem and watch the whites kill the whites, and then the blacks would come and kill essentially all the whites. And then his idea was that blacks fundamentally could not run a society. They couldn't feed themselves. It would fall into anarchy. This helter skelter, the concept of like confusion and anarchy, and that is when he, as some sort of like modern day Jesus character to a certain extent. I mean, he's quoted as saying that he's like 10 times the Pope, would come forth from the desert, from this underground lair, and then he would tell the blacks that he was going to lead them, and essentially you would have this world of Charles Manson and his followers ruling over an entirely non-white America, essentially, which is interesting comparing the Turner Diaries, where of course the Turner Diaries ends with killing all non-whites on the planet. Charles Manson is talking about in the 1960s about all whites being killed. Actually, it's not some sort of like heroic narrative, which I do think is interesting and to really dissect as an ideology. That it wasn't some total Aryan victory, which of course was a phrase often used by members of the order of whites not only taking over the country but taking over the world. Manson really believed in kind of tearing everything down into like Mad Max tier, and he didn't want there to be some like flourishing white ethno-state. He wasn't advocating for national socialist economic trade policy. He was actually willing to sacrifice like 99 point some odd percent of white Americans, whites in the world, perhaps. So then he could roll over in a really virulent form of like white supremacy, but also the classic white man's burden, like these people of color can't manage their own affairs, so I'm going to rule over them, and that's going to solve the solve all the problems of society, essentially. And wow, man, that's that's some pretty interesting, kind of crazy stuff when you think about it. But Manson, of course, put forward these ideas. He ends up getting arrested, along with a bunch of members of his, quote unquote family. But then we see the concept of really just taking the fight to the system of this anarchy and lawlessness. And that's what Joseph Tomasi really brought to the table. I mean, he ended up being killed. He was like 25 or something like that. He made a huge impact for a really young man, but he'd been involved in far-right politics for a long time. And how this intersects with the Turner Diaries, before I turn it back over to you, and I take another sip of my coffee, is that, of course, Commander George Lincoln Rockwell, who, for those who are unaware, the term commander, he actually was a commander in the Navy. He was decorated as a World War II soldier. So that's not some made-up title. That actually was his military rank. Commander George Lincoln Rockwell, who founded the American Nazi Party, really was steadfast in being legal. He actually would go ahead and meet with members of the FBI, not to rat on people in his organization, but he believed in total transparency. He believed that the system, and J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, was pro-American. It was fighting communism. It was on their side, so he believed in total transparency, believed in America. He ran for governor of Virginia at one time. And that's a totally legal political front, right? After Commander Rockwell is assassinated, what ends up happening is the American Nazi Party shifts, and then we see again this branch between accelerationism and politics happen. And Joseph Tomasi is one of the big characters that creates that. He's a young man, he's very passionate, and he doesn't think that doing protests or running people for elected office is the way to go. That he wants this helter-skelter. His ideology is influenced by Charles Manson, and he wants to fight the system directly with guns, bombs, and in his phrase, political terror. So he breaks off from the successor organization of the American Nazi Party to create the National Socialist Liberation Front. Now, the National Socialist Liberation Front is an organization that is totally dedicated to not doing things legally, essentially. But William Luther Pierce had been involved in the original American Nazi Party, so we see some of perhaps the ideology of Pierce and more of his kind of mindset that then we see in the Turner Diaries and Hunter influence guys like Joseph Tomasi, who then Tomasi, after he's killed, he's shot in the head in front of his party headquarters, dies as a very young man. But the members of the National Socialist Liberation Front who have accepted and understood and want to bring about this political terror, anarchy, helter-skelter sort of mindset, one of the characters involved in that is, of course, James Mason, who goes on to write the leaflets and the magazine articles that are combined into then what we know as Siege, that influences groups today like the Base and Atomwaffen division. So I'm kind of all over the place, Jesse, and I apologize, but I think it's really like important to like go back into the history to understand these three legs of the stool, really, that bring us to the ideology that political terror is the way to go. And it's often not talked about. Like people would say, oh, a branch off of Commander George Lincoln Rockwell's American Nazi Party believes this. And if you really look, ideologically, they're really, really, really distinct from each other. But we see this vein of Dr. William Luther Pierce that goes through to inspire Timothy McVeigh and others, really begins back in the 1960s. And these fragments bring in the characters, essentially, that play a role to develop this ideology further, even if it's in stops and starts, when people die, people leave, organizations fall apart. There's really an unbroken line. In the Catholic Church, you've got the succession, right, from the first pope on down, and in lots of ways, like when it comes to the far right, not that I'm comparing the two as anywhere, but there is like a line of succession from William Luther Pierce, inspiring in a lot of ways, breaking from Commander Rockwell. He didn't like Rockwell's style or a lot of his politics, into the National Socialist Liberation Front, then into these further organizations that leads us to today. So I'm sure you've got plenty of questions. There's plenty to go on, but I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. That was a good and complex overlap. Let me just, I'm glad you painted in the fact toward the end of your analysis there that you returned us to the fact that you are discussing events that occurred not coinciding to the launch of the Turner Diaries in the late 70s or when it was serialized in the mid 70s, but what preceded that in the movement of neo-Nazism itself in particular. The Manson killings were, of course, in the late 60s. They caused massive sort of shock and awe. I don't think that people are as familiar with the white supremacist sort of values and the vision that drove Mansonism, if you will. But yes, definitely, I think it's important that you mentioned all of the right figureheads, because you have William Luther Pierce, who is involved before publishing the Turner Diaries as one of the leading thinkers, and is affiliated with the side of neo-Nazism that we're discussing that wants to abide, for the most part, by legal mechanisms of social change. And one thing that is interesting is when you think about the splintering or the fragmentation of extremist groups, we see this often, no matter whether it's the far right or jihadism. What we're talking about with this Manson or Masonite strand of accelerationist thinking is much in tune with the same splinter and fracture that occurred a few years back between ISIS and al-Qaeda, where ISIS adopted this platform of the management of savagery, tear it down, show that it can't be functionable, show that the system itself cannot sustain unless the people turn towards the jihadists for help. It's very much a similar strand that results from similar phenomenon. When you talk about Joseph Tomasi being young, right, and when you talk about the influences that were going on inside of the American Nazi Party, and then what led up to his splintering, his contact with and his influence of William Luther Pierce, even in the era that preceded the Turner Diaries. When you talk about sort of, with regard to the personality of Joseph Tomasi, he was young, as you said, but he was also someone who was, growing his hair long, smoking marijuana, arguing with the leadership or the elderly class, Matthias Kohl in particular, and really starting to push back against this notion that the system can be changed from within. And I think that is the onset of a splinter between the two strands of interpretation that we're thinking about that takes us up very well to the late 70s. So let's jump up in that direction and let's revisit not Tomasi so much as we get into Mason. and how that he, unto this day, recently even, he kind of disbanded Atomwaffen. But we saw similar phenomenon happen into the future, where when we had post-Charlottesville, that accelerationist domination and the fragmentation coming from Iron March, the formulation of Atomwaffen, the formulation of what we just got done identifying as a 13-year-old kid-run operation, Führerkrieg Division, and all of these more accelerationist strands were basically an assault on the traditional leadership as well, meaning that their memes assaulting the boomers are very akin to the way that Joseph Tomasi and then Mason in turn would go on to assault the leadership that still believed in participation with the political process in order to enforce social change. And what you have in the bridge between what you might say is in the Turner Diaries, an adoption of one particular mechanism for bringing about societal change through the use of force. But with Hunter, you really get the serial killer strand embodied in William Luther Pierce's continued and sustained thinking coming out of the Turner Diaries. So take us on a trajectory that involves Mason, and that takes us away from that strand and the impact of the more sort of serial killer strand of thinking that is associated with Manson. How did that creep in to affect people like Mason? And what was going on in the context of that area and that time frame between 1978, the publishing of the Turner Diaries, the shift into Waco and Ruby Ridge, then the carrying out of the Oklahoma City bombings, and in between then you have the publishing of Hunter. Tell us about the influence of these ideas and how they were resonating with this more the more extremist far right, terroristic strand, if you will.
Sure. Well, and one thing I think that's important to understand is a lot of these guys. I mean, again, we're looking in the late 1960s, early 1970s as what they're much older now, but as you pointed out that Mason at the time, Tomasi at the time, and stuff like that, these are really young guys, right? So when Joseph leaves the National Socialist White Workers Party, the successor to the American Nazi Party, he ends up going ahead and promoting again this sort of ideology, which in retrospect, Mason, talking back about him, says that his 1974 leaflet called "Political Terror" was a work of the most incredible genius. And he went on to talk then a couple of years later, and he said, "In the manner described by Tomasi, one of our most eloquent statements will not be made in courtrooms, but in the streets of Jew capitalist America. The secret was he essentially stopped talking and started doing. He said that all that talk, all discussion was counter-revolutionary. The situation has been talked to death, and they're still going on talking. Tomasi knew the real difference between useless effort and effective action practically applied." So in this environment, let's remember on the left, we have organizations like the Weather Underground. There are organizers, which I think get a really unfair rap in, say, like the Black Panther Party, right? Just because they had guns, the Black Panther Party was incredibly invested in doing things like feeding kids, right? Their number one thing they did was feed kids and be community organizers. Just because you have guns doesn't mean you are violent terrorists, doesn't mean that you want to be engaged in in overthrowing, like, going to your local courthouse and like dragging people out and shooting them in the street, right? As we see in the Turner Diaries. But you do have far left terrorists, for lack of a better term, in groups like the Weather Underground that are bombing things, that are on the run, that are involved in counterfeiting, and are doing a lot of undermining the system. And of course, that's weird now in retrospect to look back that some of the members of the Weather Underground are like tenured professors, right? And are actually kind of part of the neoliberal establishment of modern America. I mean, the Republicans made a huge amount of political hay over connections that former President Barack Obama had in Chicago with former members of the Weather Underground. But let's remember that these ideologies are happening in the pressure cooker of the race riots after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. They're happening as left-wing cells are, going around and blowing things up. I mean, you've got organizations like the ones that kidnapped Patty Hearst and brainwashed her, doing bank robberies and things like that. So it's a really politically really charged environment that involves everyone. Okay, so this is the way that I think the perception of guys like, say, Manson, and then going forward, is to develop an ideology based upon how they see the trajectory of American politics continuing. That we are here in in a violent era, and we're going to respond with violence. So, going forward in terms of all this, James Mason had been involved incredibly early in far right politics, and yeah, he was not interested in negotiation. He did not want to dress up in uniform and march and things like that. He was inspired, and that's what Siege is. And we're going to do like a whole thing on Siege. But Siege is a collection of newsletters that he's writing in these early 70s to the 80s of his thoughts, and it gets increasingly radical as time goes on. But I think where we see with the publishing of the Turner Diaries and then Hunter, a fundamental breakdown, and we talked about post-Charlottesville, the argument between the political wing and the accelerationists, that sort of happens, I think, in a pretty good extent, starting in the 1980s, where we see the arrest of the Order, where everyone basically gets swept up, and we see the disintegration of the White Patriot Party in North Carolina under Glenn Miller and others. A lot of the political organizations are either people are arrested, or people are sued and things like that. And again, we've got this vacuum where there's people that are pissed off and have a whole lot of things that they're upset about, but the political wing doesn't seem to be willing to do it. So Mason, as a young man, really gets into this. And what I think is interesting too is that how Hunter is essentially based, at least in like the first couple chapters, off the mass murder spree of Joseph Paul Franklin, which, for those of you who aren't aware, Joseph Paul Franklin essentially went on a nationwide shooting spree. He's claimed by experts at several of his trials, claimed that he was a paranoid schizophrenic, had other mental health issues, but he just like went around the country shooting interracial couples, people that were involved in the pornography industry. He targeted Larry Flynt, of course, because the going after Jews involved in the pornography industry. So he shot him and didn't kill him, but crippled him for the rest of his life. And other civil rights organizers like Vernon Jordan and just random people on the street really becomes kind of the backbone for the plot of Hunter. Right. So you've got Dr. Pierce, again, like a PhD, whether you hate him or love him or have him, whatever, like an incredibly smart man, turns to the political strategy of really creating an entire book around like a possible paranoid schizophrenic, like shooting people in parking lots as the way to advance the ideology. It's a breakdown from, in the Turner Diaries, the organized structure of what he sees, and devolves essentially into lone wolf terrorism, using the example of Joseph Paul Franklin as an example, and then tapping into, he knew Mason, right? They'd been in the same organization. There was a lot of overlap in communication throughout, especially like in the late 60s, early 70s. And that sets up this framework for the lone wolf violence that continues up until this day, because once you realize you can't organize a political organization, once you realize you can't have a hierarchical organization like the Order was incredibly secretive, as they were pulling off not only robberies, but they were going after armored cars and getting huge sums of money. And the cops really didn't know that this was like an organized organization going throughout the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere, doing this counterfeiting and whatnot. And as secretive as it is, as with the oaths and all the things we see in the Turner Diaries, right? Because that's what the Order was based on. Still, everyone gets arrested. Nothing is fundamentally achieved. The ball is not moved forward. So Hunter, being published later, really taps into, well, you're not going to have a huge group, right? You're not going to have the same sort of hierarchy. It's going to come down to shooting people in parking lots and inspiring terror. And that's the political terror message of Joseph Tomasi and the National Socialist Liberation Front that inspired Mason. that then inspired Pierce, even though Pierce was incredibly classist, right? Like, even though the National Alliance bought skinhead music record labels and things like that, and made millions of dollars before the internet fundamentally changed the music industry for everyone, but especially like white nationalism, it just gutted it. Because before you would have to order from a catalog or go to a show, then you can stream on YouTube. Before YouTube, gutted everything, and the internet changed how music was produced and released and funds. Pierce was always incredibly classist. That he didn't like skinheads, he spoke out against them. He didn't like working class people. He didn't like Christians. Christians were actually banned from joining the National Alliance in its earliest days. He didn't like salt of the earth, like normal white people, right? He was very elitist, but he's still putting out this propaganda, especially then in Hunter, of saying like, oh, you're a former military man, oh, you're mad at the country. Well, he's not suggesting you go join the National Alliance. He's not trying to recruit you into the National Alliance. He is trying to recruit you into going and doing mass shootings, however, and that's a big ideological shift from everything we've seen previously in American white nationalism.
Very good, very good. And so just to keep in the vein of Hunter, and then to continue our discourse and push it up, moving toward the current arena and era. So Hunter is published, and as you suggested, it's actually a prequel to the Turner Diaries, and it's an endorsement, almost implicit and explicit, if you will, of the fact that what occurs in the Turner Diaries from the organization or the order is sort of a much more organized outfit. But what might need to precede that period, almost, it's as if William Luther Pierce is saying, is not going to come from an organization, but from the wanton violence of what we might refer to as essentially useful idiots. These are individuals motivated to kill by an ideology that attacks, he's assassinating interracial couples and civil rights advocates. And it's really, he explores in depth and in detail in some of the work in Hunter, the Jewish question and its sort of nefarious role, teasing that out a bit more. And talking about essentially endorsing this strategy, which is to endorse the serial killer strand. So I do think that, in a sense, you're right. This continuation is also representative of that broader discourse that is going on in between 1978 and 1989 when Hunter is published. And basically, this is William Luther Pierce coming out and telling us where he falls along that line and making a certain endorsement of the more accelerationist strand, at least for the time being, but letting his audience know that it could lead toward something more formal. I mean, he literally drops the term the organization altogether in Hunter and only talks about the individual. And it seems to me like this is an endorsement of that sort of strand of thinking. But this is 1989. How influential is it? I mean, you don't see academics, you don't see experts referring to Hunter. Do we see far right-wing extremist ideologues, particularly those that drive the narrative, picking up Hunter in 1989 and then throughout the 90s? Do we see it bearing any impact, or is it just representative of the broader conversation that was occurring inside of the movement between the militia, the patriot strand, and the more sort of leaderless resistance, anti-government, tear it all down form of strategy?
Sure. Well, one of the big things that I think is interesting is, it's Lenin said, right, that decades, there are decades where sometimes nothing happens and weeks where decades happen, right? So when it comes to like the ideology of the movement, things actually remain, I mean, in my opinion, after Oklahoma City, right, there's the crackdown on the militia movement and things like that. There's kind of a break, right? Things really go into the doldrums until, I would say, like, not that I got in the movement, right, and I changed everything, but around the time that I started getting involved, around late 2010s and things like that, or the early 2010s, pardon me. Because there are strong legal political organizations that kind of exist, including William Luther Pierce's own National Alliance. I mean, once the militia movement is really cracked down on, and the federal government turns its eye towards even Klansmen that had been involved in violent actions in the 1960s. There's really a pushback, I would say, kind of movement-wide, and you see a resurgence of organizations like the Council of Conservative Citizens, that of course used to be the White Citizens Council, pardon me, and there's really kind of a shift. So yeah, Hunter is published in 1989 as there's really kind of a shift going on back towards politics. But we wouldn't really be having this conversation unless something changed, right? And something I'd forgotten to point out about Hunter, how it intersects with Manson and things like that. So at the very end of the book, going back, I just wanted to get a little passage from page 252, where all of these actions that individuals have been taking around the country spark essentially a racial uprising, right, against the whites. And here's how Pierce describes it. The majority of the black militants were young males, though a surprisingly large number of females also were involved. Many were college educated, and these resentments had reached its greatest pressure. Given endless assurances of their equality by the media, by college recruiters, and their guilt-ridden white classmates and coworkers, they had more than their humbler brethren come up with a jolting and humiliating jolt against their inherent limitations. After the first day, however, many other blacks had in effect joined the rebellion. The entire black underclass, the street gangs, the chronically unemployed, and so on and so forth. And so actually, like, I wanted to point that out, that it's interesting. The conclusion of Hunter is essentially what Manson predicted of what was going to happen, right? Like these violent actions would lead to a black uprising. Pierce thought it would come from the top down within the black community, but then spread, and then there would be this widespread helter-skelter, right? So I do think that's interesting. 20 plus years after Manson was arrested, we've got Pierce writing this in Hunter to set up what he saw America being going into the 1990s, right? Basically, the movement, if you look, until the early 2000s, during the 1990s, with the exception of, say, like Oklahoma City, that things are pretty well legal and political. I mean, the stereotypical, like, I remember when I was little, you would see like History Channel documentaries on the far right all the time, and you had the Aryan Nations being led by Pastor Butler, the AN, the National Alliance under Dr. Pierce, the NA, and various other organizations, again, like the White Citizens Council, who actually had like state legislators in the South and things like that involved in the organization. It was very kind of high class to a certain extent in the Council of Conservative Citizens, and then you had the more like street kind of working class movement, where the skinheads had really kind of started to die off from the 1980s and the 90s. Then you had the Aryan Nations, and then Dr. Pierce represented kind of the cream of the crop in his mind of the white nationalist movement, of the more educated upper class individuals. But then like basically everyone like dies, right? Like in a very short period of time, Pastor Butler dies, and then the Aryan Nations essentially falls apart. Dr. Pierce dies. He gets diagnosed with cancer. He passes away, and his organization, the National Alliance, gets put in the hands. Somehow Dr. Pierce, in his like classism, picked like a boxer who liked drugs and strippers too much, based on everything that's ever come out in the media or I've ever heard from former National Alliance members. The National Alliance, which had had a multi 100-acre compound, had a huge publishing arm, had this huge music arm, basically falls apart. Then with the rise of the internet, the music business falls apart too. The White Citizens Council, which was then the Council of Conservative Citizens, starts to really kind of fall apart in the early 2000s. And the movement is really in a rut for a long period of time. But going into the early 2010s, then we see on one side the beginnings of what we would know as the alt-right, which is kind of this again more political minded wing, and you've got organizations in the interim like the National Socialist Movement that hold protests, but it's nowhere near what the movement used to be or what the movement was going to become. But you have the founding of Iron March, and this is where all of these ideas, this is where all the huge history lesson and stuff like that comes together in the modern era. Like this isn't a podcast just for history, as much as I love history. I mean, that's my one thing. I could talk about all sorts of obscure things all day long, but we're here to talk about why are things happening now. And the foundation of Iron March is a forum started by an individual allegedly based out of one of the former like Soviet republics, and it creates this kind of think tank where it's not like Stormfront. Like for those who are familiar with Stormfront, Stormfront was first created as a forum to support the candidacy of David Duke when he was running for governor of Louisiana. And then it became like a general message board and forum, and is really always like touted as the where to go like white nationalist forum, but it's not secretive in any way. Anyone can create an account. Even if you don't have an account, you can read the threads, and it's kind of really a representation for a long time of the old school movement. Like you see characters like quote Pastor Tom Robb of the Knights Party of the Ku Klux Klan regularly posting there and then speaking at like Stormfront conferences. A lot of the old guard of the movement that had been involved in the physical protests and things like that for a long time. Iron March was completely different and unique. It was entirely youthful. I mean, I had an account there, right? And in terms of like debating ideas and discussing them, it was an entirely different crowd. It wasn't the 60-year-old guy that's complaining about a black on white crime in Cincinnati or something like that, like a typical Stormfront forum thread. Instead, it was debating the finer points of like which book explaining the needs of green energy for an eco-fascist future best exemplifies like the esoteric Aryan spirit. Right? Like stuff that was totally night and day, separate from like the reactionary white nationalist like American movement, and it was international. And this is an important thing to talk about, that Iron March, of course, being founded by a non-American, brought together people from all over the world to start debating and discussing these ideas. And this is where we see the reemergence of Siege. Essentially, James Mason had been a nobody in the movement for decades at this point. Like after he had been imprisoned on different charges, he had really fallen into obscurity. But Iron March is the one that dug up. I mean, someone must have had like an old mimeographed copy of Siege or something like that, and brings it up. And so you've got all these young guys in the early 2010s that are starting to debate and discuss these ideas that had long since fallen by the wayside. They had not really played any sort of practical role in the ideology or organization of American white nationalism or anything for, I mean, I don't know, like 20 years, 25 years in a lot of ways. I mean, things really, really shifted for a long time. And then we start to see this resurgence. And that's when like the meme starts coming out. You would see it, increasingly spreading in chat rooms and things like that. Hashtag read Siege, exclamation point. Oh, you haven't read Siege? It was brought back by this forum, Iron March, that brought these ideas out of hibernation. And then we see the formation of groups like Atomwaffen Division, National Action in the United Kingdom, and others. All these splinters really come out of Iron March, which goes to show like the power of the internet for recruiting. And you've got a lot of, again, young, talented guys, objectively talented, creating propaganda where, I mean, I remember like when I started my white student union at Towson University, I didn't have any graphic designers. I basically still should just be using a flip phone, not a technology guy at all. And I had to do like recruiting. None of my guys knew how to use like graphic design, so we had to take like an old National Alliance leaflet from like the 80s of like a white blonde-haired blue-eyed woman that said "Save your race," and then we like threw on the bottom, support your local white student union, and that was the propaganda we had. But on the flip side, and I think this intersects probably in some ways, maybe you could talk about with propaganda for you in terms of the jihadi experience. But like the propagandists from coming out of Iron March that then went into actual organizations were really good. It had a very distinctive art style. It was crisp. It was edgy. It really appealed to like a lot of youth, and it was a total break from the presentation and the ideology seen in propaganda amongst American white nationalists for decades. But it was a callback in a lot of ways to the much lower budget National Socialist Liberation Front propaganda. So Iron March brings these ideas back, brings the styles back from an organization that no one had probably talked about in 30, 40 years, right, in the United States, brings all these things and repackages them for a brand new audience, and we're living with a legacy today.
Very good. Thank you for that. That's great that you brought us all the way up to that point, because it's very, very crucial to understand. It's a repackaging of old wine in a new bottle in a new context. But then it gives sort of this rebirth to Mason, and that is something that we will cover, and the influence of Mason, and we will cover how he sort of endorsed that fragmentation and sort of gained a resurrection in the movement itself when we cover Siege. What kind of impact does reference to William Luther Pierce have in these Iron March discussions, if any at all? And how do you see the impact of Turner Diaries and the Hunter perpetuating itself into this sort of restart? Is there an impact? Does it play a role in the early discussions, in particular on Iron March, in contemplating these new ways to interpret in the context of massive technological shifts, a massive groundswell of support for more radical thinking, the context of a war on terror, and all the other different things? How does it retranslate itself 30 years later in a modern, technologically enhanced context? And why does it start to resonate? And talk a little bit about that resonance. How did the more serial killerish, Mansonite, Masonist strand of thinking, how did it win out as time went on? And how did it lead to these splinters that became Atomwaffen, the National Alliance, Führerkrieg, and others, the base that we're worried about today?
Sure. Well, I mean, I really think what it comes down to in terms of like Dr. Pierce's legacy is he was generally well thought of. There's I mean, I can't even begin to count the amount of arguments I had about Christianity, in terms of like dealing with the movement. And actually, one of the biggest divides, where for a long time there was an antagonistic relationship between Atomwaffen Division and Iron March in general, and my own organizing, because I was a Christian and the majority of our members were Christian, right? Because the ideas in Christianity, I think pretty much across the board of, that the idea of like the meek shall inherit the earth, about promoting peace and things like that, really went against the views of these individuals. And Dr. Pierce's institutionalized opposition to Christianity and Christian ethics, I think in a lot of ways is probably like never talked about. I've never read anything about it, but I think it is one of the most long-lasting legacies that all of his work brought, and with the National Alliance, and of course you see in his books. Like in Hunter, there's an entire huge section where Oscar Yeager is involved with some other people in a small organization that's supposed to represent essentially the National Alliance, and they promote a character to be a televangelist and start promoting like a bastardized version of Christianity, but they're all anti-Christian. Like the televangelist in question doesn't believe in any sort of in Christian ethics. It's all a shtick to try and get the dumb rube rednecks like myself, right, who believe in Christianity, to fall in line with their incredibly anti-Christian doctrine and dogma. So that was something that was often talked about even excluding Christians from membership in organizations that were being formed. I mean, this is all still, people are throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks, sort of thing. That was a major point of contention, because Christianity, and when it goes back to a debate that happened in the National Socialist German Workers' Party in the 1920s and 30s about Christianity, and how Christianity does not believe in exploiting the weak, that Christianity does not believe in like mass blood purges of people, say if they're crippled or things like that. And even if you disagree with people, I mean, we've had a long legacy of Christians defending themselves against the invasion of Vienna, or Charles Martel at Tours and things like that. And there's some dark spots on the history of Christianity, as there are, I think, with every religion fundamentally, not those moments I just mentioned, but they do happen. But the Christian ethics were really debated and seen as being kind of the father of Bolshevism, right? The father of communism in a lot of ways, and a really virulent hatred of Christianity is apparent through Dr. Pierce's work, but then through these organizations as well, continuing to the modern day. Like, so you think like with a Christian, like Christian just war doctrine has been established in starting in Western Europe for a very long time, and Christians weren't supposed to use like crossbows against one another, right? Like like the basis of what became like the Geneva Convention and things like that on how to treat prisoners, on how to treat civilians, of the code of conduct of war. Although that really got thrown out, I think, starting in with the mass civilian bombings in World War II, and today I don't really think the Western countries really abide by a lot of the the rules, but the basis for what we would consider like the rules of engagement, the rules of war, um, are based on these Christian principles. And this is something that these organizations and individuals, Dr. Pierce included, like when he talks in the Turner Diaries about like throwing nuclear weapons at China and just killing all the Chinese because they're different. Obviously, that's a violation of like Christian ethics, regardless, I think, of what denomination you come from, including like that would be opposed to say like men like Leon Degrelle. Like General Leon Degrelle was an SS general. He was a faithful Catholic till the day he died, but he never promoted like hatred of other groups of people. He has a lot of famous things I could go into on that, but it would put them at odds ideologically with even like the original National Socialists. But this is a fight between, say, guys like Leon Degrelle and Reinhard Heydrich. Again, it's these ongoing debates that always keep coming up. So I think Pierce's legacy, as we see in the Turner Diaries and see in Hunter, is, I mean, one, an increasing acceptance of not using the political system, of believing in like political violence, but then also not being bound by any morals. Like, if you look at organizations like I bring up the IRA a lot. I'm very familiar with IRA history. The Irish Republican Army is very famous for calling ahead to, even if it was like a police station or things like that, to say that a bomb has been set, to minimize civilian casualties or even casualties of British military personnel. Like they were very polite. And, there were some dark times on both sides between the paramilitary organizations, between Republicans and loyalists, but they were incredibly polite in comparison to how I think people generally think about political violence. And that is not what Pierce was talking about in Hunter. That is not what was really being understood and accepted by Mason. And then these next generations, really, it's a rejection of like traditional ethics on civilians, on who is a legitimate target, and viewing the political struggle in a way that's really a war to the knife. Last man standing wins sort of thing. So I think that legacy of Pierce is not just like the tactics, not just the rejection of politics, but also the rejection of ethics and morals that govern a political struggle, and govern like the rule of law essentially accepted in most countries around the world. And that's one of the longest legacies. So, I mean, people ask like, why are there shootings in mosques? Like, why are there attacks on synagogues? Why are there attacks on black churches and things like that? Something that I think if you were to go back in time and interview members of different like fascist parties and things like that, back in the 1930s and 40s, that they would say like, you don't attack civilians, right? You follow the Geneva Convention, and that was has been totally rejected, thrown out the window, and essentially everyone can be a target, including people who are white nationalists who disagree with these individuals. So it's not just about ethnicity. It's not just about religion. It's also anyone who doesn't agree with them. And that's a big legacy, too, of Mason, that we see in like Atomwaffen Division and others, that even pro-whites who aren't on their team exactly, they feel no loyalty to whatsoever, and are fine if they get offed, or they will be offed. They'll be shot by the Vanguard Party or whatever. So yeah, I would say the legacy is really deep, and Pierce had a long-lasting history in a way that most people never talk about.
I would agree, and I think that that's a very, very, very effective way to put it. I think if Iron March is marked by anything, it's marked by a victory of those that were espousing a sort of neo-fascism, if you will, that is based on an ontology or an understanding of human behavior that is only the strong survive and might is right, if we were to reduce it to a framework. And that does have serious implications for what is considered an acceptable strategy and tactic, and for the ultimate formulation of a coherent worldview and ideology that can justify what essentially is most basically referred to as barbarity. In my opinion, that's where you get these more Satanist strands of thinking. That's where you get these divisions that start to percolate, a revisitation of old arguments, reframing them in a manner that is now only grown even more sort of decentralized and more based upon a role of the act of violence itself against anyone who is considered an enemy is, in a sense, the most effective form of social protest at this point, which is the clearest denunciation of utilizing the system in order to save the system or to work within the system to promote revolutionary change. And now we have this sort of mobilization towards things that are essentially right in line with what Charles Manson would have promoted himself, what Mason, I think, was trying to take the direction off into, even though, he is now claiming, probably because of Adamov and being put on, certain domestic terrorist lists, that's not his intention in disbanding some of these more formal structures. We are going more towards the decentralized lone wolf model as the future progresses, and understanding this historical trajectory, particularly how it resurrected itself, I think is crucial. And then your ability to connect that to the ontology and the distinct differences in understanding between what we could say the crowd that wanted to preserve quote unquote Christian ethics and a just war theory, or at least framing of violence in the just war framework, and those that said throw all of that out of the window. Culture and society is diseased. Only the strong, in a very nihilistic and Naziist type way, can rescue us from what will be impending decline, attributing that decline to nefarious groups such as the Jewish cabal controlling the world, the globalists, or however you want to put it. And it itself is represented now in very many different strands, in very many different ways. And not understanding that is a hindrance, particularly as we now are starting to adopt the term accelerationist and use it to apply it to almost any act of violence, even where there's no evidence it was carried out in the name of an ideology or cause. So in final conclusion, maybe you could expound just a little bit and then tell us where you're taking us next, the book that we'll be covering next week, and how that connects to what we've covered in this series thus far.
Well, we have a lot. There's so many things to cover. And as we go forward in the series, I kind of want to really encapsulate the accelerationism and make it understood, especially for the first couple episodes, because it's so important to understand what we're dealing with. Then I want to get into some of the boring history that motivates different parts of the movement, the more political wing. But I think we're going to do Siege next week, which is, we've already talked about a lot of this, but to actually dig in. Siege is a really big book, actually, and there's a lot of principles there. And I guess in conclusion, one thing I really wanted to touch on, and I'd mentioned it before, is the impact of Satanism, which is something that like with Iron March and things like that, the Order of Nine Angles is a really important, and feel free for everyone to research. But when I say Satanism, I don't mean like the Church of Satan. I mean like real Satanism, as a big inspiration for motivating a lot of these individuals and groups, including justifying like acts of terror. And we see the overlap with groups like the Base by their glorification of jihadists, comes from the inspiration of the Order of Nine Angles. Now, for those of you like who aren't aware, it's a satanic left-hand path ideology, which is something that could we could go into for a long time. But the big thing again is this rejection of Christianity. It's a rejection of like any sort of human equality. It's really against like even being nice, right? Because anything that be considered like weak, needs to be purged and destroyed and kind of sacrificed. That the overlap in the post-war period between the Order of Nine Angles and Satanism in general, and like white supremacist terror, is really clear. And I think that needs to be understood for folks who are listening, because, I mean, if you were to go back to, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, plank 24 of the 25 points is a belief that Christianity is the morals of to govern the movement, right? Like Adolf Hitler, after he becomes the leader of Germany, declares that that Christian ethics is going to govern things. They shut down the Masonic lodges. They shut down atheist societies and things like that. Fast forward to the post-war period, the Order of Nine Angles, in one of their publications, says, and this is kind of that retconning history that you see, that one of the publications, the Order of Nine Angles, said that National Socialist Germany was a practical expression of satanic spirit, a burst of Luciferian light, of zest and power in an otherwise Nazarene, pacified, and boring world. So in terms of this ideology, they really believe that it's not like Aleister Crowley, Satanism or occultism. The darker the better. The the scarier the better. That this idea like that Pierce puts forward in the Turner Diaries about an all-white world, the Order of Nine Angles takes the next level, where a lot of the members over the last couple decades have talked about creating an Aryan colonized Milky Way galaxy, that they're going to not just conquer the entire planet, wipe out or pacify every group of people on the planet, but this is going to extend into the stars. This is a very sort of like Nietzschean in the most perverted understanding of Nietzsche's philosophy. And this is, I mean, we could talk about Nietzsche in another episode, I think, which would be good, because the interpretations one gets from Nietzsche or other philosophers can be taken in a lot of different ways. But the Order of Nine Angles believes in this, the like you said, that the strong will conquer the weak. It is the duty and responsibility of the strong to conquer and kill and exploit the weak. And this is the ideology that a lot of individuals involved in Iron March and then in Atomwaffen Division and the base are involved with. So like groups like the Islamic State or others that you can see that they've done propaganda or affinity to is not based on, say, opposition to Zionism, is not based on opposition to American imperialism in the Middle East, is not even like just this person is opposed to the system. Like you can agree or disagree with those critiques, but that's like an ideological, understandable position, even if you don't agree with it, in my opinion. But like ISIS is cool because ISIS is, raping Yazidis. Because ISIS is cutting the heads off of Christians, because ISIS is like cartoon villain evil, right? Like that's why there's an affinity. It's not based on any of the deeper ideological perspectives of left or right that an organization or individual could follow. It's actually just based on like terror, and that having a peaceful society, having a world where like I could go to church with my family and go work on a small farm and mind my own business and have like a simple life is the opposite of what these people want. It's also taking a perversion in certain elements of like the folkish traditions, right, of Europeans, the victory of Valhalla mindset, that the only way to have like a fulfilling life is through like, in their mind, like heroic deeds, which is like hurting people who are weaker than you and exploiting them and things like that. I mean, it's an inversion of both not only Christianity but also like paganism and things like that, to believe in this sort of perspective of if someone's going to rule the planet, someone's going to rule the stars, right? Someone's going to colonize Mars, and that place belongs single-handedly to those that are willing to inflict the most pain, suffering, and death to achieve it. And if you're throwing your life away and taking a bunch of people with you, shooting up a mosque or shooting up a Walmart, you are helping achieve the galactic imperium of, Aryan Satanists or whatever, which which sounds crazy if so many people like hadn't bought into it, if it wasn't so clear. And you can see in like leaks that have come from the Iron March forums and things like that of guys like whipping their girlfriends while they're like holding naked, while they're holding like the book Siege and like have bite marks on them, or like promoting, you know, images of like tortured people. I mean, like really dark stuff. Okay. Like where we've gone far beyond like white people having a white country. Like that's that like political white nationalism in this are you know, so some individuals like on the far left would really disagree, but I would say the ideology, which again, like Pierce did not come up with all this, but when he talks about in the Turner Diaries, like killing everyone who isn't white on the planet, that's something that like Adolf Hitler never said. Okay, like that's not something that the National Front in Britain in the 1970s ever said. Oswald Mosley or Benito Mussolini or Francisco Franco, like none of those guys said like we're gonna like torture, kill, and murder every other person who's different than us on the planet and go to the moon, right? Like that's for Satan. Like none of them said that. This is a clear ideological thing which falls into a longer trend of accelerationism, of terror, violence, and anarchy that leads us to why young kids are being brainwashed essentially to go commit acts of terror. It's for a specific worldview that is very unique and doesn't really overlap in a lot of ways with real ideological fascism or, you know, any sort of right-wing thinking. It's its own thing. But Pierce's legacy is still with us, and these organizations and individuals have just been driven underground, and it's a real problem that has to be combated because they're not interested in politics. It's something deeper and darker than anything involving politics, and it needs to be addressed. So we'll get into a lot of other stuff, and I hope that bringing Satanism at the end wasn't too too often left field, Jesse. But you know, I think it's something that again, to understand these guys, they're not reading Mein Kampf and taking you know, its passages and saying, oh, we're going to do this. It's we're going to take the you know, okay, we're going to use the imagery, right? We're going to use, you know, callbacks to you know, the 1930s and 40s, but it's actually something I think very ideologically distinct, and things like the Order of Nine Angles and you know, Satanism and terror is going from the 1970s to, you know, well, Manson in a lot of ways, you know, talking about like that he's the devil and stuff like that too in some of his interviews. That's what we're seeing today, and we're still dealing with.
Indeed we are. And I think that the entire purpose of this long historical trajectory through the most influential books on the far right is essentially just to arrive at that, an ability to tease out and to distinguish the accelerationist trends that, I mean, we have to adopt the term. It's been adopted. I myself don't necessarily agree with the way that it's applied. But I think what we're going for here is an ability to understand the epistemological and the ontological basis upon which these ideas have metastasized. And you're doing a very good job taking us through that trajectory, because as you know, we could have 8 conversations about the Turner Diaries, but what you've done is you've captured it with concision to the degree that it will only feed into the conversation from here, which again next week will be about James Mason and Siege. And that does lead us into conversations that are particularly intriguing that involve things like Satanism. So interestingly enough, we will continue from here next week. We thank you for being with us, and I look forward to continuing the discourse. Thank you, Matt.